Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to have my panelists join me at this point, Anthony, Anita, and Eric. Thank you so much. We're here today to talk about reuse and renovation. We just saw a fantastic case study of an adaptive reuse project where a number of aspects of the building's performance and its performance at net zero energy level were tied to that very initial decision to reuse a building, right? I think I love that slide that Marshall showed where he was talking about how not building at all, or rather taking the decision not to build, might be the most carbon efficient decision to take right at the start of the project. And of course, you know, while we're not, certainly we can't stop all construction in the world, reuse, I think, offers us a great pathway to that. We actually published a small piece at the end of last year. We are going to link to that in the chat window as well about specifically the embodied carbon benefits of reuse and renovation. For today's discussion, I think we'd love to understand from our panelists who have all spent time working with recycling, with reuse, with remodeling and renovation projects about how they are using those strategies to drive sustainability goals. I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's event, Armstrong Seating and Wall Solutions, as well as Target for supporting this conversation. Also thanks to ILFI, the International Living Future Institute, and the Net Zero Conference for being our partners on this event as well. To help us talk through today's topic, we have a fantastic group of speakers. Thank you so much for joining us, Eric Corey-Fried, who's Director of Sustainability at Canon Design. Hi, Eric. We have Anthony Montalto, who is Principal and Director of Design at HKS. Hi, Anthony. And also Anita Snyder, who is Environmental Sustainability Manager at Armstrong World Industries. Such a pleasure to have you, Anita.
As well.
I'd love to start with Anthony. Anthony, you've worked on a lot of amazing adaptive reuse and renovation projects, including the ProMedica headquarters, which achieved WELL certification as well, being an adaptive reuse project. Can you talk a little bit about what the challenges and opportunities are for sustainability, as we've heard, but also for wellness, which we consider as part of that continuum of sustainability, when you're working on projects that are reuse or renovation based?
Sure. And thank you for assembling this, Avi. I look forward to the conversation. We all approach every project, with the same goals, right? Whether it's new construction or adaptive reuse. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit in general of some of the opportunities and challenges of dealing with an existing building, particularly one of vintage, and then talk specifically about how we turn some of those challenges into some amazing results at, for example, ProMedica. Obviously, when we're looking at, an existing building, and particularly having to demolish part of it, we're always looking at, where do those materials end up, right? So obviously you want to preserve as much as possible and avoid going to landfill. So, the challenge is how do you, for example, use a majority of a building that was designed and utilized for a different use in this new use, with that kind of preserving as much as possible in mind. Are there opportunities to reuse them on the project, for example? So, in ProMedica, there were some, active smokestacks from when that building was a steam plant that we had to take down for both kind of life safety purposes and envelope purposes. And thankfully, in partnership with the city and an artist, we were able to save those materials, those rings from those smokestacks, keep them on site, and not only kind of reference back to historical kind of icon on the site, but they became kind of an art and an interactive installation. So kind of that challenge of, you kind of go in and want to say, I want to, use as much of the building as possible, but there are those elements, how can you repurpose those on site? From a wellness point of view, a lot of times these historic buildings, have a lot of, asbestos, lead kind of materials that we have to abate. So, it's obviously something that we have to deal with. You know, the opportunity there is that we restore, kind of extend service in that building, and kind of you know, eliminate the health hazard that's kind of exists in a frozen state in the historic building. You know, you know, one of the opportunities that we kind of encountered with ProMedica is there was kind of a historic legacy. That building, for example, existed on the waterfront in Toledo since the 1830s, right? And kind of became a timeline of the development of the waterfront. So there was an opportunity to kind of reinvent that timeline, or add another chapter to that timeline. But also, what used to be a very kind of industrial waterfront, you know, became this incredible public amenity. So not only did we open that waterfront back up and restore a very historically significant building that Daniel Burnham was a part of, we kind of transformed how that waterfront was being used to one of kind of closed off from the city and the public to one of very active participation, kind of a celebration of Toledo of the past to Toledo of the future. But I think the most important kind of opportunity for us is, you know, is the idea of embodied carbon and you know, the global warming potential. You know, just doing a study on that, you know, we were able to reduce the embodied carbon by 67% from having built the exact same building new, and we've extended the life of that building, the service of that building, to over 120 years. So incredible opportunity, both from a public perspective and just to keep that building in place.
Right. Thank you for doing that, because I think you've outlined all the ways in which adaptive reuse is such an attractive practice today, right? So embodied carbon, of course, in simpler terms, I think it makes sense for, you know, even somebody who isn't, you know, initiated into the language of carbon accounting, that, you know, once a building already, if you're working with an old building, all the materials, all the energy that was required to put that building up have already been spent. And so you're adding very little new energy or very little new resources in order to make that building usable. And then and by doing that, you're also extending the life, as you said, of those materials that already exist in the building. So first of all, that's a great advantage. But I think the other wonderful thing that I think you outlined is, you know, there's a cultural advantage. It really marries together the social and cultural dimension of sustainability with, you know, the more construction or ecological or physical, tangible related dimensions of sustainability, you know, by really leveraging history, by leveraging location, by, you know, creating a connection to the past and allowing people to value the things they already have, countering a little bit the culture of consumption that we find ourselves in now. Thank you so much for that, Tony. Anita, I'd love to bring you in on that. You know, Tony spoke about managing the materials that exist in a project, you know, at the outset. And at Armstrong, I know you yourself have been involved with their recycling program for a very, very long time. You helped set it up. You know, Armstrong has been supporting that kind of, you know, responsible renovation and remodeling for a long time now, you know, taking back materials and so on. Where do you stand on that today? How are you trying to be a resource now to architects and designers as they're increasingly looking to adaptive reuse as a way of leveraging that embodied carbon benefit?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Avi, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this great panel, and good to see you. Well, certainly, you know, the whole year has been a transformation in construction, and certainly, you know, there will probably be a lot increase of existing buildings as we move forward in terms of repurposing and adaptive reuse. So we've been really focused on a strategy which we've called changing spaces, and we've really been focused on providing a broad portfolio of very quick turnaround capabilities, focused on the ability to design out waste from the beginning, solutions that are flexible, certainly designed for disassembly. Our systems from a ceiling system perspective are already engineered that way, but certainly following that route. And also digital solutions. We're really looking at that whole digitalization path and how we can support the community with those tools and resources to do so. And then also being able to meet some of these new cleaning needs that are not just in healthcare and schools. So a lot of changes from just a service standpoint. Also, in terms of new products, we've been looking certainly at embodied carbon. That's of course been a big area, as well as net positive products. How can we design them to be, whether it's carbon sequestration from the beginning, Tectum, our living product that we have gone through with the ILFI, the Living Product Challenge, is an example of that. So that's been our focus on the new product side. We have a very large initiative in our product pillar of our sustainability platform that's focused on designing products that can either be repurposed, reused, or recycled, and actually to be able to drive circularity in not just our operations from a manufacturing side, but also with our supply chain and hopefully with our customers as well. So our recycling program certainly is one of those end-of-life solutions. We've had our program for 21 years, so it's been out there for many years. And it is a way for us to be able to bring back material from renovation projects, goes to our closest plant, and that those ceilings are actually used as a recycling feedstock versus offsetting virgin materials, and certainly lowering that virgin impact. We've already expensed the carbon on those recycled materials in the first time, so they're coming in as a recycled stream, saving on landfill space also from the environment standpoint. And also it is a contributor to a lot of the green building standards now. We've been seeing a whole credit areas in whether it's Living Building Challenge or WELL or LEED, where there's now, whether it's the impact reduction or the construction waste management plan. So it provides a solution in that aspect as well. So we're looking to increase it. So hopefully we can have that as part of our discussion, is how we can continue to see circularity increase within the building industry.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Anita. As you said, even if you just use ceiling systems as that one point, right, and we start to examine all of the things that happen there. I love that, you spoke about solutions where that new solutions have lower embodied energy as well. So that, even if it is an adaptive reuse project, yes, you're making use of the building's, existing embodied carbon, but you're also paying attention to the materials you do bring in onto those projects as well, and making sure they're as low footprint as possible. Of course, DPR did that as well with their project. Marshall spoke about bringing CLT in. And I think that's really important. And the other thing, of course, I'd love to bring that up a little later for us to talk about circularity, right? How do we think about not just building materials and products as being a circular system, but that buildings themselves becoming sites for circularity, understanding them as, just as a stop on the way of material flows, and how do we understand those flow systems? That's a great thought to leave us with. I'd love to bring Eric here, but before I do that, I just want to remind everyone, we are taking questions throughout today's session. I see that we have a few questions for Marshall. I think once Eric, I go to Eric and I get some remarks from him, I'd love to bring Marshall back, and maybe we'll have him respond to a couple of questions there that are specific to that project. And it'll also give our other panelists some new topics to talk about, I think. But please keep your questions coming. As you enter a question, if you see a question that's already been asked, please use the thumbs up sign below the question to upvote it. Questions with the most votes get asked first. Also, I'd like to again thank our panelists, Tony Montalto from HKS, Anita Snyder from Armstrong, and Eric Corey-Fried from Canon Design for joining us today, talking about reuse and renovation. Eric, you know, we know that we are trying to get to carbon neutral on all new construction by 2030. So we have, but then beyond that, so looking beyond that 2030 deadline, which we know is urgent, we are going to have to start updating, upgrading existing building stock. So even if we're not interested in adaptive reuse as a specialized practice, to some extent, everybody's going to have to start looking at energy retrofits and so on pretty quickly. So what should we be preparing ourselves with now when we look to hitting that second deadline of getting all our building stock to carbon neutral or as low carbon as possible? How can we get better as architects and designers, just at this general attitude of reuse and renovation?
Well, thanks for saving the hard question for me, first of all, and thanks for having me. It's also great to share a panel with Anita, because I can tell you Armstrong's been a pioneer at this. I don't want to date Anita's age too much, but they've been at it for a while. And when I was at Living Future, they were already way ahead of the game of others. So I applaud their efforts. It's funny because I was in a meeting in April with a client, and she had said, I'd asked them about their sustainability efforts, and her response was, well, we want to be at 80% carbon neutrality by 2020. And I said, it's April 2020, right? Like, it's now. And she kind of, oh yeah, you're right. Oh my God, I've been saying this for 10 years and I guess now it's finally here. And they quickly and quietly changed all their goals to 2025. But nothing's changed. Like, they haven't done anything to get there. And so now we're helping them roadmap. What are you going to do in the next 48 months to get you there? Because that's really what you need to do. And because of the time value of carbon, we can't have that typical human response of, well, if 2030 is our deadline, I guess I'll wait till December 2029, and then I'll worry about it. Like, we can't get in that headspace at all. At Canon Design, what we've done as a firm, and I'm really privileged and honored to get to be part of this, is we've committed to targeting net zero energy on every project. We don't know how we're going to get there, but we're working on it. We've committed to cutting embodied carbon in half on every project. There's various ways to get there, and we're working on it. And we've committed to a healthy material and resiliency strategy on every project. And again, there's plenty of ways to get there too, but there's no equation that doesn't include existing buildings. And so sometimes the things that we're doing are as mundane as just asking the right questions at the right time. And so when we're meeting with clients, especially early on in the kickoff, we're explaining to them the urgency and the opportunity. We're really trying to open their mind to new uses of this existing building and really rethink a lot of those assumptions around reuse. Because if you're starting with, well, we're just going to tear this down and build a new one because newer is somehow better, I'm advocating for interjecting and saying maybe there's an opportunity here to do that. As you're going to see later with Stacy Smedley's demo on the embodied carbon construction calculator, a lot of the assumptions that we've had around materials and embodied carbon are surprisingly different than what reality is. We just went through this exercise with Stacy for a project we're doing. We were able to get 50% embodied carbon reduction, but it wasn't in the areas that I was thinking of. Like, I guess I assumed the drywall was going to be a major contributor, and it was like a tiny little blip on the calculator. And really it came down to the foundations and our choice of steel and our choice of aluminum more than anything. And so I think we've all adopted this triage mentality more than anything of, it's not going to be perfect. We're not going to do it on every project, but what can we do? How can we target the big things to really get to an 85% level of impact? And it really begins with, if there's an existing building involved, we have to stop and ask the question of how can we reuse at least a portion of it in some way, because the numbers are so damning, for lack of a better word. And I'm really presenting it as an opportunity for the clients. It's exciting if you think about it.
Right. I mean, when we're on a tight deadline, it means that you're not starting at, square one, which is fantastic. B, as you said, we are in a tight deadline, so we need to inculcate this attitude towards understanding where the big benefits are and where to prioritize efforts. And I think your illustration is just fantastic on that. Marshall, I'd love to bring you in on a couple of questions I think here that are specific to DPR's experience, but then there's also a few questions I think that I'd love to have us address as a panel. Marshall, Shoaib Nawawi asks, can you talk about the cost aspects when you decided to use CLT on the project? What did it do to the budget of the project?
Yeah, to be honest, we thought that the CLT expansion was going to be, we knew it was going to be on the cutting edge, and through completion of the project, it really turned out to be more on the bleeding edge. The industry has a lot of demand currently, which is nice and promising, but not necessarily the capacity for production. Couple that onto a smaller scale retrofit to an existing building, and it's a very unique test case. Flew up to the manufacturers a couple times to check out their operations, see how they're doing. They have had 85% year-over-year growth and continue to open up new plants, as well as we see more manufacturers come on more and more by each year. So I think that those will improve, and then we've already seen those economies of scale improve, but right now there is a cost premium, at least in the materials. However, with it being a digitally prefabricated product, you can really speed up the time to install, which then you cut your overhead burn rate, saving money for the project, and for certain clients, you can come to market faster, which generates revenue for them faster. As we've seen with the products that we've approached, when you take a holistic view, you can make it to be a more cost-effective material to use.
Good. And really quick, Marshall, is DPR looking at passive house principles at all on any of your projects? The question from Sterling Morris.
We have not that much, to be honest. Personally, I am a fan of passive house and the design of it. And I think that's part of the incremental improvements of, we start with LEED, and then LEED's not enough. And so we go to net zero energy. Net zero energy isn't enough, so we go to net positive energy. And then we really start getting more efficient. And I really like the ideas of passive house and a great strategy to really drive down that overall EUI, but we just have not gotten there yet.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Marshall, for joining us again. I really appreciate you taking a couple of questions from the attendees.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question for Tony, Eric, and Anita. There's a question from JL Carm, and obviously everybody's thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic as they're thinking about, the climate crisis as well. And he asks, in the height of COVID, how does each panelist see best practices in repurposing buildings and schools for efficiency that are currently empty with telework and stay-at-home mandates? Obviously, that's framed as a more maybe temporary kind of reuse strategy, but I'd love to think of it also in terms of long-term. Are we going to see a reframing of, say, footprint calculations for offices and so on, and then are there sustainability benefits there? Tony, maybe you want to come in first, and then we can have Anita and Eric respond if they'd like.
Yeah, in the temporary sense, a lot, we've looked at, hotels, office spaces kind of being repurposed for healthcare kind of emergency ICU bed locations, and been involved in a couple, convention center retrofits. And that's been kind of an interesting, study, but, that would fall more in kind of the temporary bracket. In looking at not only our own office and workplace situation, but kind of interfacing with a lot of our clients and talking about, what does the future of space looks like around how we live, how we work, how the two blend together. There's been some really interesting studies on, are there other purposes for hotels, right, as kind of breakout spaces and meeting spaces? Are there, what does a future of workplace look like? And right now, I think there's a lot of questions around, there's probably a lot less answers, but a lot more thinking about the opportunities in it. For sure, I think remote work is going to impact the spaces of tomorrow. I think that there's probably going to be an impact on the amount of new space that we build for sure. We're even looking at the area of our current office and kind of the reduced occupancy of that, of who might be there on a daily basis and what other things we can do with that space. So I think, it's an interesting conversation. I don't know about Anita or Eric, but, we're kind of in a stage of more research and kind of being prepared for what the future might hold, and then ready to kind of come up with solutions, seeing how this unfolds.
Yeah. Eric, reuse and COVID-19, anything on that?
Well, it's funny because, you start to get into these meetings and you start to think that the virus has attacked us, and I guess humans are the victims of the story, but the future that awaits us doesn't necessarily have to be something that happens to us.
Right.
And it feels like a lot of people are adopting this kind of wait and see attitude of what's the future going to be. And I kind of pause it back with the question of, well, what is the future we want to create? Because could you think of a better time to re-question all of the dumb decisions of the last 3 decades that we've made? What a great opportunity to rethink office and transportation and traffic and community and streets and vibrancy and everything. So maybe we should be thinking more of, well, some of those legacy systems we don't need to hold on to as much anymore, and maybe this is our chance to do better. And when it comes to buildings, maybe this also means that we could start thinking about different ideas. The monoculture of use that we typically do in an office, where we say that is an office building and that's all that's there, and that is a shopping mall and that's all that's there. Maybe those lines are going to start to blur, and maybe they should. And maybe that really opens up things that we had missed, because otherwise our typical human brains are going to just go to, dealing with our anxiety more than anything else. I had a client ask the question if we should cover every surface in copper because the bacteria doesn't live on it as much. And aside from how beautiful it would be, I said no, because it would be insanely expensive, not to mention the life cycle impact it would have, and there's not enough copper in the world, and on and on and on. But I think that reactive approach is the wrong one. I think instead we should say, well, how can we design better systems that control viral flow? How can we think more about the buildings and what they'll need to be? How can we start a process of future proofing to look at more of a resiliency strategy long term for any building, so an office building today can become a makeshift hospital when need be, or become a residence in the longer term future when it's more beneficial.
Eric,
Absolutely.
are you stockpiling copper there in your apartment?
Oh yeah, yeah, I got it everywhere.
Eric, I think, among other things, what you mentioned about air quality, I mean, that's likely going to be the first retrofit that a lot of people are going to have to make following this pandemic, especially given the new advisories coming out from, the WHO and CDC. It's less about the surfaces, more about airflow. And airflow redesign is not a material switch. That's a retrofit project, right? And yeah. I think that's really interesting. There are ways in which we can use this opportunity to make better spaces. Tony, of course, thinking of the WELL standard as well. Anita, I'd love to bring you in on that. You mentioned, cleaning protocols and dealing with that on the new products. Talk a little bit about COVID-19 and, specifically, and if there's any connection, rather, to remodeling and renovation from your point of view.
Yeah, sure. Yes, we've done the whole research path as well. We've actually reached out to a broad group of customers, and we've been following what's been happening in WELL and LEED and Fitwell in terms of changing of their certifications in terms of indoor air quality and materials. Certainly, we've gotten a lot of questions from a cleaning standpoint, and also a lot of questions about, well, back to the whole transparency piece of what are you using as part of protection. So we've been looking into that whole antiviral area to see if there's more we can do from a protection standpoint. So that's been a big focus. But also, you know, as you mentioned, the whole airflow, and certainly whenever you're doing something with HVAC in the plenum, you're going to most likely do something with the ceiling. So I could see that being more of a turn in terms of possibly having to redo and the opportunity to recycle those products and reimagine them into something different. And, you know, as these spaces have to be multi-flexible for different purposes, that's really the opportunity to come up with solutions that can do that as well. I'll just add one other area, which would be certainly be acoustics, and being able to add retrofit areas for acoustics. If we think of the whole health and wellness, I mean, that's another big area that, as we're, you know, de-densifying workspaces, that may have to change how that whole acoustical plan was set up. So I think we're in the same kind of pause and reimagine for a better space moving forward.
Right, absolutely. And I think, you know, from what all three of you are saying, I think there's a way that we can use this pause to push research along the lines that, you know, we've always wanted to, right? Your point on acoustics being a great example. Hannah Berryhill asks, are we overlooking energy usage that happens with adaptive reuse that doesn't happen in new construction? If so, how can we account for that when comparing the two? For instance, additional chemicals used when cleaning existing materials, energy spent to modify existing building elements, etc. So are we messing up on our calculation somewhere? Or do we actually have to do more to retrofit buildings than we think we do? Eric, do you want to comment on that?
Well, the short answer is no, of course not. But the long answer is, yeah, probably. Because like within Canon, we have an entire facility conditions team, and that's all they do. And so we're using them to essentially look at a portfolio of buildings on a campus. Let's say here's 175 buildings on a campus, and then we do energy models of them and then triage them and then essentially prioritize which ones need to be retrofit first, because they're looking at them from you know, what is the EUI usage for energy for each. And so it enables a large university to prioritize which buildings need to get modernized first. So if you do it right, the answer is no. But if you're just kind of going in and, you know, ripping out the old and saving as much as you can and not really thinking about how to improve it, I think you're missing an opportunity. But in truth, you should model these buildings just like we would model a new building. And if anything, some of those weird leftover remnants of the building become quirky, interesting design opportunities to use as well, and start to almost order some of the other fun things that we do. Imagine a building that has cool terracotta detailing in it, and that starts to inspire a motif that we start to use as a pattern throughout the building. So again, I think everything at the end is design and really putting ourselves in the shoes from an empathetic perspective into the shoes of our clients.
Right.
But, you know, I think the tendency is always bigger, 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 when in fact, to me, it's more about flexibility more than anything else. And an existing building affords you just as much as anything. The only real issue I see with existing buildings is the lead paint asbestos thing. But in truth, we've been dealing with that for 50 years, and every architect has had to deal with it. It's just something that we just know how to handle. So it shouldn't scare anybody off from using an existing building.
Right. Tony, you want to comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, Eric brings up some great points. And, you know, for us, it's, you know, when we get into these type of projects, it's as much about aligning all the stakeholders with this kind of vision as it is actually implementing it, right? So, for example, we don't go into preserving or reusing an existing building without knowing that there's going to be decisions we're going to have to make that kind of align with that mindset. So to Eric's point, I mean, there's elements that we celebrate. We celebrate the grittiness, the dirtiness, right? And you kind of almost freeze it in time, and that becomes part of the story of this building. There were incredible. I mean, the steam plant for ProMedica, for example, was used as a steam plant, right? So there were a lot of kind of artifacts that became part of the story of that space, right? You celebrate the volume, you celebrate these intricate little dirty details sometimes that become kind of a frozen moment in time, and the owners and the users and the contractors, everybody knew that that was part of the preservation, right? The challenge is always, you know, typically those envelopes, you know, weren't designed for air and vapor, you know, barriers the way we're doing it today. So how do you balance that kind of preservation and that restoration with not having to kind of build a whole new building inside of it, right? So I think to Eric's point, it's everybody's either aligned or, you know, you're not really doing it the right way. So yeah, I mean, it's the short, as Eric mentioned, the short answer is, you know, hopefully no, we're not kind of, you know, not doing the math correctly, because everybody from, you know, the smallest sub to the contractor to the owner to all the design and engineering team is aligned with the goal of, you know, reducing embodied carbon and preserving as much as possible. Or you're not really doing, you know, you shouldn't be elevating that building to this discussion, right?
Right. I mean, I think the points that both of you make really point to this larger idea that, I mean, there's a reason why we talk about adaptive reuse as a distinctive strategy. It has its own special attitudes and approaches, the ones that you guys have just outlined, right? You want to be able to leverage the history of building, but you also want to be able to, you know, use all of that as part of your modeling, Eric. You know, as you said, you wouldn't model, excuse me, a renovation project as though it were a ground up project, right? You need to come at it with a different kind of planning mindset right from the beginning, as you said, Eric. So there needs to be a strategy that's particular to that way of working. So basically, if you do it well, you know, it pays off. You know, if you don't do it well, nothing pays off. I have a question here that actually came up during Marshall's keynote. So Marshall, I'm gonna have you weigh in on this as well. And then, you know, if you'd like to stay on, stay on. If you don't, you know, if you'd rather be doing something else, that's totally fine. Shoaib Nawawi again asks, can you talk a little bit about material selection? Now, they asked that question during the DPR project. So Marshall, if you want to weigh in on that, but then maybe Anita, you want to talk about it from a, you know, a manufacturer's point of view. You know, how do you guide people towards responsible material selection as a manufacturer? And then of course, Eric and Tony, if you have anything to add to that, we'll hear from you as well. Marshall, do you want to talk about material selection?
Yes, of course. So our first and foremost goal for this project was to take care of people and place, and proper material selection really hits on both parts. And we saw that with the mass timber structure, obviously, but did not have a chance to actually talk about the remaining materials that go in. We were very mindful of what we were selecting, and try to leverage as much resources that is already out there. So when we went to go and specify products, we really looked at products with declare listings, with health product declarations, with cradle to cradle certifications, and use those as baseline requirements for what is the palette that we have to work with. On the one hand, it does take effort to go and find, because not everyone has gone through those accreditations. But on the other hand, it's actually kind of nice where there's so many materials to be selected from, and where do you start and how do you choose? If you're just starting with the greenest and most sustainable products, you really narrow that palette selection down, and it makes decisions a little bit easier. A lot of people, when they come through this particular DPR office, a lot of ours are very colorful and painted in bright colors, where this one is not. It's a much more subdued color palette. But part of that is because we chose materials that are more reflective in nature, of where, you know, we have wood for biophilic value, but we also use shapes and hexagons that you see reflected in, say, beehive structures as well. And we think with this proper material selection that is made of natural materials, reflects natural materials, that it will stand the test of time instead of just be kind of the in color or in palette scheme for right now.
Right. I really like that idea of, narrowing the field straight off the bat, right? There's a lot to choose from. So starting from a point of picking the really most responsible materials and then building that, narrative around it, like, and then there's all that, that creative work of sort of figuring out what is the palette, what does it say, what does it mean, and how will it feel? I think that's such a great approach. Anita, do you want to comment on that? How do you guide specification? How do you guide material selection?
Yeah, definitely. Narrowing the field is exactly what we've done as we've seen this drive for transparency over the years and all the different certifications. I'm like, how are we going to manage all of this? So what we did was we created a portfolio, which we've called Sustain, and all of the products in that portfolio, which were about 95% of our mineral fiber, fiberglass, acoustical ceilings. We're still working on some metal and some wood. But all of those products have the same checklist of sustainable attributes. So they all have declare labels, they all have a health product declaration and an EPD, which has the embodied carbon information. They're part of our recycling program. They meet CDPH emissions. So our goal was to make it simple and save you time from having to research to find that most sustainable selection of products and have it in that one portfolio and have all the documentation there to back it up. So our goal is to continue that path and to start a product when it's launched to be sustained in the beginning. So we're kind of working backward on the ones that we already have launched, but moving forward, that's been our goal, so that it makes it easier as you're looking for those in your designs.
Just before we move on, for anyone who needs a refresher, we're here talking about reuse and renovation with Eric Corey-Fried from Canon Design, Tony Montalto from HKS, Anita Snyder from Armstrong, and also joining us is Marshall Andrews from DPR Construction. Sterling Morris asks, for any panelist, what is your quick perspective on green building programs like the Living Building Challenge, LEED, etc., contributing to adaptive and reuse projects? So, how useful are those certifications when you're talking about an adaptive reuse project?
I probably have a pretty biased view in that I'm a LEED fellow with USGBC, and then I also used to work for Living Future. So obviously I love Living Building Challenge and what it represents. So I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, but I can tell you, as someone who's worked outside certifying buildings and on the inside of the certification body, the importance that it sets. The best thing about Building Challenge is that it exists. Quite honestly, it has set the bar for where buildings need to be. When it first came out, everybody said it was impossible. And to Jason McLennan's credit, the founder of LBC, he's like, no, it's not. This is the obvious conclusion of where we need to go. And now it's really building itself for scale. So it's incredible. On the other hand, certifications are expensive and a pain in the ass and a lot of work and everything else. And so what I counter to the question is, are you then supporting your client? So if they pursue LEED Gold or net zero, are you then supporting your client by going back to them and saying, how has your investment in LEED Zero or in LEED Gold or net zero, how has that investment paid off for your employees or your students or your patients? And have you really done that work? I don't see how you can do this and not do really kind of a beefed up post-occupancy evaluation type piece to go back and measure if it was worth it or not. Because so often we're given this situation where a client comes in and says, give us LEED Gold. And I ask them, why do you want it? And they look puzzled. And I say, your own organization wants to be carbon net positive in 10 years. LEED Gold's not going to get you there. Why do you want LEED Gold? And then that starts a conversation around, well, maybe, I guess we want net zero. Well, what kind of net zero? Because there's different types, they come in flavors. And what would that look like? And let's engage in that conversation. At the end of the day, we are architects and designers, and therefore who better suited to lead our clients through this very confusing, frustrating, technical, in industry speak laden world of LEED and WELL and NZE and Passive House and LBC than us. So I don't think we should just dutifully put our heads down and fill out certification checklists for them. I think we need to engage them in a much bigger conversation around what do these outcomes really mean? What is, instead of going for LEED Gold, what would it mean for you to have the healthiest building on campus? And what would that look like? And what would that mean to your students and your faculty? What would it mean to the rest of the campus? What would it mean to your other building and your roadmap going ahead for your facilities management people? Let's have that conversation. And suddenly that starts to get very exciting, because I have hundreds of people that'll work on LEED projects, and they're all kind of bored of it, right? We do it, but we're much more interested in really having a much bigger impact that goes beyond filling out templates.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. I mean, to Eric's point, I think it's, that all of these things exist is fantastic, because it always changes the mindset, right? But, for us, it's always, I like to classify it as, are they after the steak or the sizzle, right? How many clients, just like Eric said, say, I want this, and what do they want? They just want to say that they were certified at whatever level. But for our responsibility is that we just change the way, we have to change the way we practice, right? We have to incorporate, our, the 2030 challenge and all it's going to take us to get there. And for us at HKS, we've, from the top of the organization, we've changed the way we work, whether our clients are asking for something or not. It is our responsibility to provide the healthiest building we can for its users, for the environment, in terms of the resources we use. So, for example, we're creating a curriculum around the AIA measures, right, of design excellence, right, and what all of those mean, right? Not only what our peers say it means, or what the AIA has defined it, but what does it mean to HKS? What is our responsibility to deliver on all of those, right? So that, at the end of the day, if we have to fill out something, if that's the goal of our client, that's not our goal, right? So whether we're looking at new construction or adaptive reuse, the goal is always the same, right? What is the healthiest way for the users and the environment that we can execute the solution, that we can bring this new facility online? And it's to Eric's point, it's a mindset, right? We have to live it. Again, I love that these organizations are out there, because without it, we wouldn't be talking about a lot of this stuff, right? So they're doing amazing things. But at the end of the day, it's on us to change the way we design. It's on us to change the way we deliver buildings or products that we put on the market, right? I remember our library, our interiors library 10 years ago was huge, and now we said, no, we're only going to have the materials that, and we actually developed mindful materials, which we kind of rolled out, which, our library is significantly smaller now, because the materials that actually live up to the bar that we set are significantly smaller. And we flat out tell, we don't want your lunch and learn. We don't want any more of these products unless they comply to X, Y, and Z. And that's something we have to start with, right? Or we're going to consistently be having to deal with materials and products and practices that'll never get us there.
Right. I just love this idea of certification not being a goal in itself, but rather being tied to those human impact goals. And all of us have to make meaning of them. Eric, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to just build on what Tony said. We had just implemented this thing throughout all the Canon design offices, where if you want to do a lunch and learn, you either have to be on mindful materials database or have a declare label. And then COVID happened, and we didn't get to use it. But if we ever get back to the office, I'd love everybody to steal that idea and say to any outside sales rep that wants to come in and do your little lunch and learn, great, but you have to be on mindful materials or declare, or at least have an EPD, at least,
Yeah, that's the only way we're going to change the industry, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tim.
No, I'm done.
Yeah, and that helps me as a sustainability manager to be able to drive within our company. So I welcome those mandates, like this is how it has to be, because otherwise it's like, okay, this person may want this or this. So it makes it very helpful, which is what LEED, well, all of those certifications have been able to do, is at least provide a common language for us, common requirements, you know, declare HPD, EPDs. You know, we didn't use any of those a number of years ago. They just weren't that important. We had them as Armstrong. The EPD work we've done, you know, for the past 10 years, but at least now they're being used for a purpose of being able to design better. And that's the important part. And then also just, you mentioned a roadmap. That's really how we're using it. We have on our campus in Lancaster, we have a LEED Platinum building. We're in the midst of recertifying it now. So we're also looking at, you know, how can we make our campus for good, for the people, for the community. So we're going through that exercise and strategy now, and in the midst of recertifying, and then also what should we be doing across the entire campus from a focus on people, health, and wellness.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Anita, you set me right up for the next question from our attendees. Before we do that, I just want to say, you know, we're talking about reuse and renovation with Anita Snyder from Armstrong, Tony Montalto from HKS, Eric Corey Fried from Canon Design, and Marshall Andrews from DPR Construction. We're gonna take a few questions at a fairly rapid clip now, and so, you know, we'll try and get through as many as possible. We have some 24 plus questions on the docket, so we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Lance Collins says, since sustainability and resiliency includes social equity principles, how can we avoid gentrification and other negative impacts to communities as we reuse buildings? Tony, maybe you want to come in on that, especially given the experience with ProMedica.
Yeah, no, it's again, you know, there's so many things that, you know, I think as an industry, we jump to solve the problem too quickly sometimes. And in doing that, we forget about thinking about all the different stakeholders involved. A lot of the work that we do is focused, you know, we spend time visioning at the beginning to really expand the question to, you know, not how we can transactionally execute a program, but how can we transformationally execute impact and influence on what we're doing, right? So, for example, for ProMedica, you know, the city was dying in a lot of ways. In Toledo, it was cut off from the waterfront. There was not a lot of influx of small businesses or new businesses, retail use, residential use, and part of the ProMedica campus was not only, one of the goals was not only to revitalize or reuse the waterfront in a way that it never had been used, to connect the city to this incredible asset, to create a park that sponsored events and farmers markets and accessibility to everyone, but to also create this, you know, for not only with the 900 employees that now would be on the site, but with the support of an adjacent hotel site and supporting local businesses around, you know, that $40 million commitment resulted in $600 million of additional kind of revenue in the city. So again, I think all of us are saying the same thing, right? You know, the bar isn't let's just do X the best we can. It's what else can we do with you know, transformationally, what else can we do with the projects we work on? Sustainability and wellness, inherent as that is access, right? Access to information, access to resources, access to daylight, access to all the wonderful things that the environment offers, right? In the same way, not kind of taking those and isolating and saying this group is the only one that can use them. So again, the challenge for all of us, you know, is when we rethink the way we approach things, we kind of open the door to what is the possibility? What is the possibility to get more people access? What is the possibility that this project is not only geared towards 900 people going to work, but all the surrounding neighborhoods that live there? How can what those 900 people, how does what those 900 people need to work from 9 to 5 benefit everybody who lives there 24/7? And that's a different way to approach, right? That's the transformational. That's thinking about impact and influence. And whether it's a new building or existing building that you're reusing, none of that changes. it's that building is a threshold to something much greater than what the program is.
Right, right. Yeah, we just have to get so much better at setting goals and measuring impacts, especially when it comes to some of those broader systemic changes. Tashrik Ellie asks, what are the most common barriers to recycling or reusing building materials? Anita, maybe you want to talk about this one. What makes recycling so tough?
Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's being able to get, the whole goal is to get in and out of the project quickly. And I think that is a barrier. And then, of course, finding material streams of programs in order to return materials. I mean, on the ceiling side, certainly we have a program, we have a structure for that to happen. And it still doesn't. I mean, it requires a change in thinking. It requires planning up front. It requires thinking about the building and those materials as a valued asset, which is not how we normally think of them. We think of them as waste, and they're not. So it's really changing that mentality and thinking of them differently, and having that infrastructure in place throughout the whole construction process to be able to make it happen.
Okay. Eric, I'm going to come to you with a rather broad question. Dominique Hargreaves asked, with the tools available today, can we presumably reduce embodied carbon in buildings and infrastructure by about 30% at least? Is that just possible with what we have now?
It's absolutely possible, but it requires an interruption to our normal process that I don't think we're normally used to. And a large part of my work just internally within Canon is looking at that process and trying to figure out how I can interject at different times. So for example, if I want to do a mass timber building because of the embodied carbon story, I have to make sure that they don't design in a 32-foot structural grid in the building, because that starts to preclude my opportunity to make it mass timber. I need to get it more to the 30-foot range. So how do I do that? We do it early in the proposal phase before we're even talking to the client. We do it in the interview phase, and then we start to do it in the early design kickoff phase. And one of the bits of advice I have for everybody is that if you're at all in charge of sustainability, don't let them put you at the end of the agenda. That's a common trick. That's a common trick that project managers do, is they have their agenda that they want to get through, and then they tack on sustainability at like the last 10 minutes of the 4-hour workshop. And so I don't let that happen, and I call them on it because I want to be up front. And so I'm doing a sustainability kickoff workshop tomorrow, and I'm the first thing because I want to set the broad vision. And if I can set the broad vision and get them excited around outcomes around health and resiliency and embodied carbon and energy, then it'll frame and influence everything that happens in the 4 hours after that. So to Dominique's question, absolutely it's possible. We're using the embodied carbon construction calculator, the EC3 now, to do that on certain projects, not on all, but eventually I want to do it on all projects. We're using Tally, the Revit plugin, on some projects, but not all. I want to do it across all projects. I want to bake it into the process as just a normal thing that we do, and to help influence and really provide an internal feedback loop to the designers so it can shape how the project evolves. Because if we wait until CDs or construction documents, it's way too late.
Right. Chidima Abuka asks, how are we working with the real estate industry to get clients to envision building reuse rather than new build whenever possible or applicable? Marshall, I wonder if you want to jump in on this one. As DPR on projects, I mean, how do you speak to the developers? How do you speak to your sort of end clients about reuse strategies?
Yeah, it really comes back to what their priorities are and what they need to achieve. Where if the only barrier is that they feel that they can't achieve what they want because it's not creative enough in thought, and okay, we'll just knock this building down and then start from anew. Well, that's overly simplistic, and we really don't have to take that approach. What is the business model that trying to achieve here, and how can we fit into that? It can be an interesting story from folks, but usually we see them to be pretty receptive. But it does take an integrated design type approach where we can't just make recommendations out of a box, and a lot of things are intertwined. And so the sustainability kickoffs, as Eric mentioned, I think are of utmost importance, not just with contractor, not just with developer, but with designer and also particularly third-party energy modeler up front. Show them of, yes, it is an old building, but we can make it sustainable with just these measures here. And here's kind of what we think that it will cost. And you will save so much else in time, energy, effort to knock that down and build anew than if you just reuse.
Right. Tony, I think this next question is probably for you, given how much you've been talking about sort of the cultural dimensions of adaptive reuse. Harold asks, could the architects talk about their architectural strategies of mixing existing buildings and new volumes? Is it always about that contrast between the new and the old, or are there other methods? He suggests that the work of Carlos Carpa could inspire us again.
Yeah, look, every building should have kind of a unique and authentic expression to, which is a combination of both aesthetics and performance, right? So, at the steam plant, for example, that building was designed as a steam plant, right? Not for housing 900 workers and really taking advantage of views and daylight to the lake and the surrounding park that we created. So, but that was a landmarks building. So we came up with we had to go through a very rigorous process to, both honor and preserve what Daniel Burnham had designed, and then do kind of an appropriate modern kind of addition to it. And in that case, it was very much about contrast in the sense of not only architecturally, but speaking to the building service up until that point, that was kind of a factory and industrial building that really didn't house people, that didn't connect to the water, didn't connect to the surrounding. It was kind of a Daniel Burnham kind of icon that happened to house, a steam plant, to one that, took those same volumes and really expressed those volumes in a very healthy way for its users. And then the addition kind of connected to the waterfront and the park in a very different way. It was much more outwardly focused, but we applied the same rationale behind the rhythm and the use of materiality and planes in a much more modern way. Personally, I always like to, I think it's sometimes an injustice to replicate. So I appreciate what Carlos Scarpa does in a very, very sensitive, but modern way to do it. But I think it should always be tied to a vision, a vision that balances the idea of art and science, right? That building was designed of the time and with the materials and the technology that were known at that time, and buildings today should take all the best we know about science, building science and materiality, and keep in mind life service of a building and embodied carbon and all of the things we've been talking about to create kind of a meaningful expression that is both complementary to what was there, but speaks to what we know today as well. So I don't know if that, so it's not, for me, it's not a kind of yes or no, or it needs to be this way, but there needs to be purpose. There needs to be a rigor in developing, what that solution is.
Yeah. Eric, you were going to come in.
Well, I think the person that asked the question about Scarpa, they're probably thinking of the Castel Vecchio in Verona, which I've been to, and it's amazing. It's an old bombed out building. It was literally bombed out by the Germans, and he was pretty restrained in that. But if you're looking for a more modern, quote unquote, modern example of a great adaptive reuse project, I encourage you to look at, in Atlanta, they have this thing called the Beltline, which is an incredible story. But they have this, I think it's an old Sears and Roebuck factory that's now being called the Ponce City Market. And it's probably the best adaptive reuse of an existing building in the last 10 years that I've seen, that I could remember in a while, just how elegantly done it is, and what a catalyst that's going to be for the Beltline and for the whole city. So
Yeah.
if you're looking for the new Castle Vecchio, maybe that's, well, nothing compares to Scarpa, but you know, it's a more recent example than one that's, you know, 60 years old.
Yeah, and also I would say an exemplar for restrained approach as well. You know, they did very little intervention in the building, you know, and it's beautiful for it. There's a few different endorsements, Eric, for what you said about, you know, wanting to imagine a new world. I'm just going to say that because it's not really a question, but you know, there's a lot of people who really resonate with that idea. You know, about the fact that we have to use this time during this pandemic to work with a new world. I just got word. It appears that I'm really sorry to everyone. It appears that Stacy Smetty might not be able to join us today. You know, so we might have to. We'll do our best to offer the EC3 tool demonstration at another time, if that is indeed the case. I'm really sorry about that, but that does give us a little bit more time maybe to take on a few more questions with our panel here, if they are able to stay on a little bit longer. Harold asks, and again, this is a question that's come up with a few different people, to what extent could planning policies from local authorities or planning boards focused on embodied carbon, save more existing buildings? There's another question about local government framing policy around embodied carbon. I'd love to hear a couple of responses on that. Maybe even Anita, from your point of view, in terms of, you know, how you deal with code and building to code from your product standpoint when you're, you know, obviously innovating. And then also from the other panelists, I mean, what is your opinion on what's going to get embodied carbon into into the sort of hands of planners, into the hands of policymakers?
Yeah, from a codes and standards, we have a whole technology group that does focus on codes and standards, and they certainly follow, you know, ANSI, ASHRAE, all of them. We follow and participate on a lot of those committees. We do a lot in the area of acoustics with looking at speech privacy and sound transmission and all of those areas. So we're very involved from a codes and standards standpoint. From the embodied carbon standpoint, we as Armstrong are part of a group called Materials Can, which is the Materials Carbon Action Network. It was actually formed by Skanska and the Carbon Leadership Forum, as well as Interface is leading it, and then Armstrong is part of it, USG is part of it from a drywall standpoint, and Certainteed from an insulation standpoint, and then Kingspan and Superior Essex joined as well. So the whole goal behind Materials Can has been really to educate about embodied carbon and how important it is to look at the materials and to select materials appropriately in order to reduce embodied carbon. Also to educate about the health effects of, you know, embodied carbon. It relates to climate change, so it's not just about the reduction in buildings, but it also the connection to health. So we've done a number of webinars. We've connected with the buildingtransparency.org effort with Stacy, and Gensler is also a part of that effort as well. So there's been education ongoing. We've done webinars, and we will continue to do that. So that's been kind of our effort in that area, and it's really about education and awareness. We also are part of the EC3 tool, certainly, and I wish I felt comfortable giving a demonstration. Maybe Eric does, but I'm not going to go there. I can get you to the website, and it is free for you to sign up. So I'll tell you that much, but that's all the further I can go.
Eric, you wanted to comment on that?
Perhaps the best thing that a city could do to encourage embodied carbon is do a mandatory deconstruction policy like we have in a handful of cities, mostly on the coasts. overnight, it creates both jobs and reduces waste going to landfill. Number two, adopt the 2021 provisions of the IBC that address CLT and mass timber. We've done that here in Oregon and Washington, and this is why the Pacific Northwest is the mass timber capital of the country. It's not because we have a lot of trees. I mean, that's part of it, but it's also that we've really paved a codeway to allow this. Without getting too technical, essentially you can do up to 18 stories under type 3 in 2021 for mass timber, which is amazing. And then we could start to see mass timber creep into other project types beyond just low-rise offices and low-rise condos. And then also to have maybe a much more of a performance-based approach to embodied carbon rather than a prescriptive-based. You don't want to just dictate every building's mass timber. That's, you know, that's not always the right answer. But if you do it around performance and maybe requiring either an EC3 or a tally approach, and that's part of your submission, I know it's another hoop to jump through, but it will really start to change the impact for cities. And for cities that have targeted net zero energy or carbon neutrality, like the entire state of California wants to be carbon neutral in 20 years, this is the only way that they're going to be able to achieve that in that time period.
And wonderful. We do have Stacy here today. Hi, Stacy. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be with you, Stacy, in just a minute. I'd love to get, you know, one last question in. And I think this ties back maybe full loop to Tony, your initial question. There's a question here about how do we do environmentally positive historic restoration and reuse? And I know that's a little bit, you know, besides the point maybe for the topic here, but I think we do have to think about adaptive reuse as a way of preserving our built environment as well. So any thoughts on, you know, just that historical element? And I think, Tony, you'd probably be the best person to kick us off on that. And if any of the panelists want to do that too, and then we'll go to Stacy.
So Avi, I'm sorry, what was the specific question around?
Using adaptive reuse also as a way of restoration of historic buildings,
yeah,
much as you did, you know.
Yeah, obviously you know, the Daniel Burnham steam plant had a historical significance that we used kind of not only as a kind of catalyst to have this conversation, but it was significant for the city. You know, multiple developers had kind of looked at that site before and kind of couldn't come up with a proper solution for saving it. But yeah, I mean, there's you know, adaptive reuse does offer the kind of almost forces the question of, you know, how can we preserve, you know, architecturally and culturally significant buildings. This one, obviously, it kind of long outlived its service as a kind of an energy providing building, but it had kind of been on the, you know, on the waterfront for 120 years when we got there, right? So whether we wanted to admit it or not, it was on the skyline, it was on the waterfront of Toledo, and it was an amazing opportunity to rethink, you know, what that building could be and for the future of it. But yeah, again, you know, we established, you know, goals early on, and that those goals kind of rolled into how we would actually clean and restore the building in very environmentally sensitive ways. And there were some limitations to, you know, quote unquote, how clean some areas could get, right? And that's, you know, in my mind, that's not a compromise, because there's a beauty in the kind of patina that these buildings have that is worth, in a way, sealing. You know, we sealed a lot of that into, you know, what it was. We weren't trying to make the building look other than what it was. So there is something wonderful about preserving that. But there are some big concerns when it comes to that air and vapor kind of barrier that we need to address. And, you know, if it's not on the outside, what does that mean to continue to let that come in, not only for the service, but for the kind of environmental conditions that we're creating on the inside? So again, there's not one easy answer, but it definitely something we need to be sensitive about. You know, what are we restoring or preserving? What is the eventual goal, and how does that align with the overall vision of what it is? Now, when the building isn't historically significant, obviously that opens up a lot more. But then again, sensitivity should be always maintained to what can we leave in place as is and add to, not dismantle and turn into waste.
Right, right. I think that's really interesting. I think first of all, I think the historic preservation argument itself is being questioned, as we consider buildings that are not just of architectural importance, but rather asking what buildings are important to communities, that may not be on a landmarks list, but still hold meaning for the people that live around it and that use it every day. And I think what you're suggesting is almost like that can we look at the sustainability aspect of adaptive reuse and the need to preserve built environment almost as, motivators to each other. So can we use sustainable adaptive reuse, the embodied carbon equation, to almost argue for a preservation of historic buildings as well? And the challenges that you noted, of course, duly noted as well.